Bootstrap provide a kind of grid system which is a very efficient and well thought system to design a kind of application for different devices. And the idea behind grid system is that the whole content is organized, the content of the website is organized in the form of containers, rows and column. So the idea is that you define a big container, and then within this container you can have rows and columns to allocate or arrange your content, and the content should always come inside the columns. So, and the hierarchy is something like this. So you have containers, then you have rows, and then in rows you can have columns. And if you want to have a nested content, and you have, then you can add rows within columns, and then you can add multiple columns within this. For example, in this case, as you can see that we have a kind of one big row which have two columns, and on the column on the right there is another row which contains further two more columns to separate it further. So this way you can organize your content in terms of rows and columns, and then we will go into more details how this actually support you in creating a very responsive application. So the since the content is placed inside the columns, the Bootstrap, what it does is that it divides the whole screen in a columns. So for example, you have you can see the whole screen as a set of 12 columns. So in every device the whole screen is divided into 12 columns, and then you can adjust your you can select, okay, you can adjust or you can define these columns to arrange your content with them. For example, let's say if you want to show content on half of the screen and other content on another half of the screen, then you can select kind of 6 column for, you can create a kind of one row, and then you create 2 column which span 6 columns each. So similarly you can divide your screen, for example, in 4 parts by defining 4 columns, and each column will span 3 columns. So this way you will come up with a kind of equally divided 4 section of a screen. So it's a kind of optimal way of dividing a kind of your screen into a different columns. It will become more clear when we will see the actual examples, and then when we will move on and we'll try to generate our website. So so after you understand the basic idea behind the grid system, now what's important to know is that how Bootstrap support or how Bootstrap distinguish different devices, and then how it allows you to generate a kind of interface or design for different devices. So Bootstrap distinguish 5 different devices. So any device with more than 1200 pixel is considered an extra large device, and it will always have a kind of one view or a similar view. Even if it's a very extra widescreen view, you will always have a kind of one interface or a single design for a device which is greater in extra large device. So similar, they are large device which can be tablets or landscape devices which are more than 992 pixel and less than 1200 pixel. Then there are medium sized devices, and then small devices and extra small devices. And then there are fixed number of pixels available for you to generate a content within them. For example, this container has a fixed length, a fixed width, which within which you should put your content. For example, for extra large devices it have 1140 pixels available to you. But now after that, we later on we will see that there are different kind of containers also, but we will come to that later on. And how Bootstrap distinguish between different devices is through using a prefix. So for example, since everything works with classes in Bootstrap, you will see that, for example, if you want to create a column, all you need to do is add a class col column. But let's say if you want to say that this column should on small device should be like this, then you can add a prefix sm to identify that it is a small device. If you want to have a different configuration or different setting on a medium device, then you can do you can specify the prefix md. So Bootstrap provide different prefix that you can attach to your classes to generate or to have a setting or to have a same class act or same object act differently on different devices. We will see that also in example. And the number of column, as I mentioned, the whole screen is divided into 12 columns, and there is a kind of gutter width which is called a kind of space between each column. For example, if you see in the previous slide, there is a space between each of the cell which is available here, and then this is the space which is called gutter width, and it is hard coded to be 30 pixel, so 15 pixel on each side of the column. So this will allow you to have a kind of very kind of elegant space between content, so that the content of two different column does not kind of touch each others. So here is an example of one simple container or grid which has kind of two columns, and then it has a nested row within this. So what we did here is that we first created a kind of column container. This gray and blue has are classes that has been added to just see where the container, how the container look like. And then then the first row contains two column, and then the second column contains a row which contains three further columns. So as you can see, this is how a grid will look like, a kind of nested grid will look like. So you can also, there will be a kind of all these examples are also available, will also be available to you in the Moodle, and you can find them in, for example, grid system overview.html, where you can get the code of these examples and play around with them to get your concept clear. Now moving on, so like I said, so there are different kind of containers available to you. So there is a kind of simple container which you can define using the class container, and it has a fixed width which we saw in the table, this table. So if you define a container, a simple container, then it will have a kind of fixed width which you cannot change. But if in case, for example, if you want to have a kind of content which should always span the whole screen, then there is another container available to you which you can use, which is called fluid container. In order to see the example, we can see something. For example, here if you zoom out of this website, you can see that some of the content are always spanning the whole screen. These are designed, or these are using a fluid container, but some of the content which is always within a fixed length is this container. For example, here this which is always fixed width. And to be more clear, maybe I can show you an example. For example, we have this layout container type. This is an example that I created, and if we want to see in different how the containers kind of are shown on different devices, we can open our developers console, which is usually accessible via F12, for example, in Chrome or Firefox. So in the developers console, we can see how the website or the page will look like in a kind of on different devices. For example, here is a responsive device which shows a kind of which shows that right now this device is using 1324 pixels. And let's say if we try to reduce our screen size and reduce our pixel, as soon as it goes below the 1200 threshold, the container size changes. Now we are in the now we are no more in the extra large device range. Now we are in the large device range, so the maximum size of the container has been reduced, but the fluid container will always remain the full width of the length. So based on your requirement of your website, you can see which container to use. So for example, now we are going step by step lower into lower devices, and now I think 562 or something. Now we are in the small range, and then in the small range everything is full width. So the simple container and fluid container will look the same, and this way you can use according to your requirement whatever container you want to use. So moving on, these are two different containers which you can use.